as they talk in a way that shows such indignation that we would dare talk about this, have additional debate. So I would suggest that there's a deeper cause driving that defund the police that needs to be stopped. Because I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, in Canada today, it's not easy to be a police officer. I speak with police officers on a regular basis. I compliment them and thank them for their service, because it's not easy when you have so many things working against them, whether it's how they feel demoralized, when they put sometimes hundreds of hours of work into an investigation only for that perpetrator to be let back out on the streets. Absolutely unacceptable. Whether it be some of the other issues that are faced as we continue to bring awareness to mental health and trauma-related mental health injuries, and how all of those things brought forward. In fact, it was an honor, and my colleague from Bruce Grey Owen Sound is here, it was an honor to be able to attend the Sam Sharp dinner. Now, that was specifically in relation to the military and the story of Sam Sharp, but it talks about that bigger issue of occupational brain injuries and PTSD, and how it can have a devastating effect. So morale within police departments across Canada is certainly a huge issue. Now, if I could, Mr. Speaker, there are two specific concerns that I wanted to bring forward that are related to this, and how we need to make sure that government is responsive to the concerns. And I would simply suggest that when it comes to making sure that the RCMP and every aspect of what that looks like in terms of being able to support our men and women who wear the red serge, or whether that be the other police services across our country. It was raised to me, and I won't get into the specifics, but I have a local law enforcement member, and I know he'll know who I'm talking about. But he talked about how he served as a police officer in Afghanistan, training national police there. And he highlighted to me recently how, even though he suffered occupational stress injuries as a result of that service, and was there partnered with the RCMP, because he wasn't a current serving member of the RCMP at that time, Mr. Speaker, he is not qualified to receive the supports that RCMP members would receive, and therefore he has had to bear the brunt, and has been successful and is a community leader today, but has had to bear the brunt of being able to make sure that he fights for those supports himself. And as he shared his story with me, of which I greatly appreciated, hearing how he was fighting. And I know my time is running very, very short, Mr. Speaker, but I would simply say as well, there's so much work that needs to be done, whether it's support for our police services, municipal, all the way up to the RCMP, whether it's law and justice reform, whether it be support for our veterans and our military. There's a lot that could be talked about, but Mr. Speaker, it's a worthy thing that we are talking about, and something that we should continue to talk about. And I find it very, very disappointing that the Liberals and their partners in the NDP would be so quick to dismiss a chance to raise these important issues. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Interesting words. I can tell you, and I've been a parliamentarian for over 30 years now. Most of that time has been in opposition, and I can honestly say that at the end of the day, it's really amazing in terms of how this particular Conservative Party, even though it supports legislation, and the member himself said he supports the legislation, does he not realize that what they're doing with the amendment is they're attempting again to prevent the legislation from passing? If the Conservative Party was true to what they actually say inside the House, then why would they oppose having this bill actually go through automatically? The NDP proposed with unanimous consent to have it go directly into third reading, and the Conservatives say no. Would the member today make a commitment now that he would be prepared to see it start third reading today? We don't have to be debating the deletion of some 5-6 word short clause. Would he not agree with that in principle based on what he's saying?
Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
It would only be a Liberal and a socialist, of which many, I would suggest, certainly the Environment Minister openly admitted that he was a socialist. But it would only be this left-leaning coalition that we have in this country that would be so scared of doing their jobs. Terrified of it, absolutely terrified of talking about the issues that matter to Canadians. But I would ask that particular member why in December 5th of 2016, that member, I can't say his name, but the member for Winnipeg North, seconded by Mr. Graham, who is no longer a member of this place, be amended by deleting Clause 1. So, Mr. Speaker, they're accusing Conservatives of doing things that member himself has done on multiple occasions. That's nothing more than politicking, because they are hiding a defund the police, anti-police agenda within the ranks of their party. It is shameful, and they should be absolutely disgraced because of that terrible precedent that they're setting.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I take umbrage with a number of comments, starting with respect for the police. At Health Committee, we had police testify on the toxic drug crisis, and as soon as the Conservatives didn't get the answers that they didn't like, what did they do? They tried to test the credibility of the RCMP and undermine them. This is totally unacceptable. These are people that protect us day in, day out. He also cited that the NDP's got nothing done out of our deal. I'm going to name a few things. A national dental care plan, a farmer care plan so people can get insulin that have diabetes, a school lunch food program, a youth mental health fund, anti-scab legislation, a doubling of the GST tax to help people deal with inflation, a doubling of the firefighter tax credit and search and rescue tax credit, a renter protection fund, red dress alert, more money for childcare and housing. I can go on and on, Mr. Speaker, but maybe he can name just one opposition party outside of Tommy Douglas bringing in universal health care that has got more done for people, or maybe he can even name one thing that the Conservatives have gotten done in the last 9 years.
For Battle River Crowfoot.
You know, what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is he just provided a list. I don't have time to dispel many of the myths that member is propagating. But, Mr. Speaker, let me simply say this. Even many of the things that are on that so-called list of accomplishments are things that they compromised on, things that are not actually accomplished, things that are not being delivered, or things that certainly are not, that are billed as one thing. But when Canadians, including Canadians that reach out to me to ask questions about the specifics of those programs, express extreme disappointment, including members, although there aren't too many of them. There are a few people in my constituency that have voted NDP in the past, and they have expressed to me extreme disappointment with how that member and that party has sold their souls to the Liberals. But, Mr. Speaker, let me say this when it comes to the toxic drug crisis. There is a very, very clear sentiment that I hear across this country, and it is that the failed policy that the Liberals and the NDP are pushing upon Canadians is not something that Canadians support. It needs to end. Free drugs, in many cases, taxpayer-funded drugs. We need to get people who are suffering the challenges associated with addiction into the treatment that they need so that they can get better. Not simply, as the minister suggested the other day, that they should simply not die alone. Mr. Speaker, they shouldn't die at all. Let's get them into treatment. Let's give them hope, because that's the promise of what this country is, not the embarrassment that it has become under those NDP and Liberal government.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to take part in this debate on Bill C-20, which is basically a bill. The purpose of the bill, essentially, is to increase public confidence in the police and to hold them accountable, hold those responsible for our safety and security accountable. So this bill, which deals with public complaints about the RCMP and CBSA, this will make their work much more effective in the RCMP and at CBSA. Today, in 2024, the challenges are very different from 30, 40 years ago. The fact that, well, I won't talk about social media, but the transmission of information, access to information, it's never been faster. It's now possible with AI and other technological tools, like, for example, smartphones. Because of these tools, national security challenges are very different. They're completely different, and we have to adapt. And that's why this bill, as I said before, the purpose of the bill is to increase trust, public trust and confidence in the RCMP and CBSA, and also to ensure that their job is done properly so that there are concrete solutions brought to the problems police face today. We also have to understand, Mr. Speaker, that information is key to security when you're talking about crime, the kind of crime the RCMP has to deal with, especially when there are foreign powers interfering in our country and, in fact, even infiltrating our country. Canada has the longest undefended or unmilitarized border in the world. So the Americans share that border with us. So we're not the only country. I guess I should include the U.S. in that. We share the longest unmilitarized border in the world. So the border between Canada and the U.S., the southern border, but there's also a border between Alaska and northern Canada, northwestern Canada. So the challenges, the border challenges are huge, and we should be very happy to know that security at our border is among the best in the world, but there are still some challenges, including that of illegal firearms. And given those realities, the Border Services Agency has to deal with completely new challenges, and that's why we need to review some of the ways the CBSA and RCMP do their work. And that's what the purpose of this bill is, to improve on the current situation. It's not perfect, but on the whole, we think it's a step in the right direction. Among other things, it would improve communication between various police partners, whether it's CBSA or the RCMP. And the bill would also make the flow of information much more fluid. And we also need to ensure public confidence in our police authorities. So if unfortunately there was an incident and someone found themselves in a situation where they felt they were mistreated or abused in dealing with a problem by the RCMP and so on, we need to make sure that those situations don't fall through the cracks. So we need to tighten up public access to a complaints mechanism, and the investigation into those complaints has to be done properly. And that's where we have some concerns, because there are police forces who have reported that there have been cases where an individual Canadian was not behaving appropriately, and it was dealt with, but there was a complaint, but the complaint might have been somewhat frivolous, and there's a risk of doing damage to a police officer's career for a long time while the complaint is being investigated. So we did want changes made to the bill, which unfortunately didn't happen. This bill would also provide greater flexibility for new challenges, as I said before. So take, for example, car thefts. In recent years, there's been a spike in car thefts, an incredible spike, and we need to attack that problem directly and come up with concrete, effective solutions. And that has been done, and the police have been very receptive to what we've done. And our leader, the member for Carleton, made an announcement in Ontario and the next day in Quebec. The first announcement had to do with how we should grapple with this problem. And we recommend a much more punitive approach to those committing those crimes. We really shouldn't be allowing people to serve time at home on the weekends under house arrest. So people who had convictions were able to still stay at home and serve their sentences in the community. No, there needs to be hard jail time for car thieves. So that was the first approach, which was to focus on the criminals and give them stiffer sentences. And then the second part of our response had to do with CBSA and port authorities, and that's why our leader made an announcement in the Port of Montreal, and it was very well received by the police. They said this is the very first thing we should be doing. So, because the port authorities are often the first to discover stolen vehicles in containers in our ports. So, by giving them the power to use scanners in order to see through containers, to see what's in those containers. And so we also recommended hiring more people to use those new scanners to get this job done. So our proposal, as expressed by the leader of the opposition, the member for Carleton, our suggestion was make the penalties tougher, stiffen up the sentences, and also equip the border services and port people with more people and more resources. So these are concrete actions we're talking about, not just talk. And just a few days later, the National Assembly in Quebec City passed a unanimous motion along the exact same lines as the Conservative approach, i.e. stiffer sentences and proper resourcing. So car theft is an important issue. And there's also the issue of illegal weapons. We know there's been a mind-boggling increase in illegal weapons flooding into this country. And when it comes to this Liberal government's approach to illegal weapons, they took a totally dogmatic approach, a totally bureaucratic approach. And yet it was perfectly clear. On the front page of the Globe Mail, you could see all the weapons that have no business being in this country. They're not hunting weapons. They're assault style. And that's another area where things need to be done right. So when we talk about security, when we talk about the border, when we talk about the RCMP, we do it respectfully, but in concrete terms, with realistic, responsible, applicable, effective solutions, and not like the Liberals, whether it's with the RCMP or with CBSA. We need to provide good security to all Canadians. We thank those police services for their work, which unfortunately all too often requires them to put their lives in danger to protect us, to protect the security of this country. So we're in favor of this bill, that's why, but we want to adjust it. We like to make a few changes, but in general, it's a step in the right direction. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'd just like to correct the record. When he talked about hunting weapons, the Bloc was never in agreement. We were the first to condemn some of the weapons that appeared on that list. When it comes to firearms, also the Bloc's position is, in my opinion, the best approach. We would ban assault weapons like those used in the Polytechnique massacre. Those weapons should never be allowed. But on the one hand, we have the government that wanted to restrict hunters' rights, and then in the official opposition, they wanted to continue to allow assault-style weapons to circulate, and that would allow for another Polytechnique-type massacre. Does my colleague agree that the Bloc's position is the best? Now, member for Louis Saint Laurent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just simply remind the member that the member for what's it called, Bras du Nord, anyway, whatever his writing was called, it was very clear at committee, that member himself, and this is, I'm just going by memory, it's not word for word, but he said, this was the Block's idea, so that's the facts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in any society, the public should have trust in its law enforcement agencies. Only then, we can't maintain security in any community with just the implementation of the laws, but with the very clear involvement of the community, and the community should have trust in the law enforcement agencies. I would like to ask the member whether he agrees that this bill will, through the establishment of this commission, will work towards increasing transparency and helping build Canadians' trust our law enforcement agencies.
Honorable Deputy Louis Saint-Laurent.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the comment of my colleague. I think I said many times that we will support that bill, and we are saying that the bill is going in the right direction. And yes, we need to confirm the responsibility of our people who are working in the RCMP and les agences de services frontaliers. Sorry, I will say that in French, because if I
The CBSA.
try to say that in English, I'm not quite sure I will get right on the target. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is we have to modernize our rules, obviously, because in 2024 and the years ahead, the issue, the challenges are far different than what we had 30, 40 years ago because of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and also social media, and also the transfer of information. And we are saying that this bill is going in the right direction, not as good as we expected, but at least it's on the right direction.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech and his recent statement that the facts are stubborn. Despite the fact that the Conservatives say this bill is important, but what we're seeing them do is delay and filibuster. And the Conservative Party is blocking all kinds of things. They filibustered at committee, and today this debate is pointless because technically it's about the short title. So the Conservatives are making us waste time debating whether we should keep the short title or not, while at the same time the Conservatives say this bill is important. So I don't understand. It's a self-contradiction. The honourable member. Mr. Speaker, I think it's unfortunate to hear a colleague who's been here for 13 years and 2 days now, if I'm not mistaken, 22 days, rather, 13 years. So he was elected in 2011 for the first time, and I congratulate him on that. But it's unfortunate to see such an experienced member saying things like that. That's why we're here, Mr. Speaker. We raise issues, we debate issues. That's entirely appropriate. And when it comes to debating a short title, I would remind him that we're not the first ones to do this kind of thing. Questions and comments?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take the opportunity to correct something from my honourable colleague from the Bloc Québécois. He did use the word military-style assault rifles to referring to legislation. There is nothing in the legislation that refers to that, so every time I hear that, it does bother me when we hear misleading comments that confuse Canadians. But my question to my honourable colleague is specifically about this bill and why it's taken so long for any legislation from this government when it comes to accountability. This was actually passed at committee last November. Here we are 6 months later. And to give another example, I sit on the NSICOP committee. Well, that act was mandated to start review a year and a half ago, and the government has yet to bring legislation forward to do that necessary review. Could the member just elaborate on the importance of actually dealing with accountability legislation and the lack thereof by this government?
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, the last time the bill was debated was in November. So for 6 months, this bill should have been debated. And in those 6 months, these people saw their way clear not to debate it. If they think it's so urgent, why did they wait 6 months before bringing it back up?
Continuing debate to the honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this bill for the first time. I understand, I think I'm only going to have 2 minutes there, Mr. Speaker, so I'm not going to be able to address all the concerns, but I just want to start because, again, there's been a lot of the commentary with the debate so far about somehow that members should not have the opportunity to debate. It's one of my biggest observations I find very frustrating when members across all parties want to have the opportunity to speak to a bill, and yet we're constantly, and especially with the current government in the last couple of years, countless time allocation and restrictions of the ability for members to speak to legislation here in this chamber. So really, what is this bill all about, Mr. Speaker? It really renames an existing body that already exists with the RCMP. It obviously expands upon that, but most importantly, it does expand to cover the Canadian Border Service Agency too. And this is very important because currently the CBSA is the only public safety agency in Canada without that independent oversight body for public complaints. And establishing this independent review body will foster and enhance public trust and confidence in Canada's law enforcement and border services institutions, something that I think all parties desperately agree to, that it's very important. And as I just mentioned in my previous comment, Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that this bill has languished for the last 6 months and it hasn't been a priority for this government. I'm going to address a number of concerns, recognizing I only have a few seconds left. But the concerns I want to highlight is the lack of consultation around this bill, specifically some other issues around potentially how the actual members of the Commission will get appointed, and the lack of independence in the process. I will get to that when this bill becomes a priority for the government once again, Mr. Speaker.
Comme il est 13h30, la Chambre...
It being 1:30, the House will now proceed to private members' business, according to today's order paper.
Affaires émanant des députés, reprise du débat en deuxième lecture.
Resuming debate at second reading of C-375, an act to amend the Impact Assessment Act, federal-provincial agreement, standing in the name of Mr. Deltel. We will begin with the Honourable Member for Nepean.
It's my pleasure to rise today to speak to Private Members Bill C-375 regarding federal-provincial agreements in the Impact Assessment Act. We appreciate the member of Louis Saint-Laurent's interest in the Impact Assessment Act, which plays an important role in sustainable development and economic prosperity in Canada. Colleagues, we need an efficient and effective review process for clean energy, critical minerals, transportation, and other major projects to keep our economy competitive while creating good, well-paying jobs. We recognize the important role that our natural resource and clean energy sectors play in ensuring the prosperity of our country while meeting our emissions reduction targets. These targets include reducing emissions to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, a net zero electricity grid by 2035, and overall net zero emissions by 2050. An efficient and robust regulatory system is essential to advancing the projects that will help achieve the net zero targets, and the Impact Assessment Act is an important part of this system to ensure that a clean environment and a strong economy go hand in hand. While the Supreme Court of Canada provided directions on specific changes needed to the Impact Assessment Act, changes that we recently tabled as the part of the Budget Implementation Bill, the Court also confirmed the role of the Parliament of Canada to enact impact assessment legislation to minimize the risk that some major projects pose to the environment. The Court recognized the clear federal role and the clear need for federal impact assessment legislation. In its decision on the Impact Assessment Act, the Court underscored the need to exercise cooperative federalism, respecting the authority of each jurisdiction. The Government of Canada is keen to work cooperatively with every jurisdiction under the Impact Assessment Act. Bill C-375 has been introduced under the wheel of provincial cooperation. However, it would result in the provincial assessment process being the only process for projects subject to an agreement. Bill C-375 aims to promote agreements between the minister and the provincial government to exempt potentially wide-ranging projects from the Impact Assessment Act. The Impact Assessment Act already focuses on only those major projects that are most likely to have the potential for significant adverse effects in areas of federal jurisdiction. Blanket exemptions of these projects from federal assessment without appropriate safeguards is not collaboration. What this means is that the federal government would no longer have the authority to manage what is clearly their responsibility, with no role in determining the potential effects of a proposed project that are within its own jurisdiction, nor be able to identify ways to mitigate those effects or even decide whether those effects within its own jurisdiction are in the best interests of Canadians. This is contrary to cooperative federalism, which the Supreme Court of Canada encouraged. The Supreme Court of Canada was clear. We must respect each other's jurisdiction, but we also must work together. By working together in coordinating regulatory processes, we achieve our collective goal of attracting investment and projects that advance a low-carbon economy while protecting the environment and Indigenous rights. Cooperation and coordination are central objectives of the Impact Assessment Act to ensure that impact assessments are done as efficiently as possible. The Impact Assessment Act already requires that the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada offer to consult with other jurisdictions on project assessments, both upfront during initial planning and throughout an impact assessment. By working together, we can clearly focus federal involvement on those matters that are squarely within federal jurisdiction. This provides process certainty and reduces duplication during project reviews. The Impact Assessment Act includes tools that allow for coordinated assessments, delegation of aspects of the federal impact assessment to another jurisdiction, joint review panels, and substitution, which allows for a provincial process to replace the federal process. These legislated tools reflect the flexibility needed for cooperation and can be tailored to meet the needs of each jurisdiction and can include sharing information and expertise, coordinating or jointly undertaking activities such as public comment periods, Indigenous engagement and consultations, instruction to proponents and technical reviews, as well as substitution of a provincial process for federal process. We know these tools can work. We have had tremendous success under an agreement with British Columbia, particularly through using the provincial process as a substitution for the federal assessment process, while retaining the ability of both orders of government to exercise their responsibility to decide on whether effects within their jurisdiction are in the public interest. We are keen to extend this success to other provinces and truly achieve the objective of one project, one assessment. To this end, and in response to the Supreme Court, the Government of Canada announced through Budget 2024, Fairness for Every Generation, amendments to Impact Assessment Act that further advance the principle of one project, one assessment. The amended Act, as proposed through the Budget Implementation Bill, will provide certainty for businesses and investors through measures that include increased flexibility to co-develop a harmonized approach to assessments, where the federal government and a province or Indigenous jurisdiction can enter agreements to share responsibility for different elements of assessment. This approach will greatly reduce duplication and result in the best placed jurisdiction undertaking the most appropriate aspects of an assessment, which would be set out in agreements. Importantly, federal obligations with respect to the consideration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous consultations will be maintained, and final decision would remain with each jurisdiction, ensuring the accountability to the public on effects within respective areas of jurisdiction. The Impact Assessment Act also seeks to maximize leadership of indigenous peoples in impact assessment processes and enables cooperation with indigenous jurisdiction in recognition of our nation-to-nation relationships. Bill 375 does not recognize the unique role the indigenous peoples have in the Crown's assessment of impacts of major projects. The Impact Assessment Act recognizes the special constitutional relationship between the Crown and indigenous peoples and the particular perspectives and interests they bring to the process. Mr. Speaker, this private members' bill should not be viewed as a tool for collaboration. Instead, it creates a tool to effectively eliminate any cooperation by removing federal requirements from impact assessments altogether. The ultimate goal of this bill is to have no federal impact assessment requirements apply and to eliminate federal decision-making in assessments of major projects, even where there is clear federal jurisdiction. It is clear that we already have the tools needed to collaborate effectively with provinces under the IAA, and these are being strengthened through amendments proposed in the Budget Implementation Bill. I encourage my colleagues to reject this private members' bill and rather focus on supporting true cooperation under the Impact Assessment Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Le débat continue avec l'honorable.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak today to this bill. This bill brought by the member for Louis Saint Laurent, who is one of my colleagues on the Environment Committee. Now, the member for Niagara has made a beautiful speech, but this bill to us seems useful because it will improve coordination between the federal government and the governments of Quebec and the provinces. It will prioritize the autonomy of provinces when it comes to protecting the environment. C-375 would amend the Impact Assessment Act so that, in some cases, the federal process would not apply to a designated project. What this means, more concretely, is that if a project is a designated project, then the provincial assessment would be used rather than federal impact assessment. But this is not about exempting any project from environmental assessment. We don't see it that way anyhow. I will bring up some conditions that must be fulfilled through this bill. First, designated projects must be through a written agreement with the responsible minister, that is the environment minister, and the government of a province. The goal must be to identify mitigation measures to mitigate negative effects of projects, and the public must be consulted, and there must also be ways out of the agreement through a precise process with defined mechanism. First of all, we must acknowledge that this legislation is significant. It's very important. Therefore, it's important to guarantee that the provisions in C-375 properly govern the process for not applying the Impact Assessment Act. We must also ensure that the rights and prerogatives of each order of government are respected. To begin, in committee, it will be important to distinguish the amendments proposed in C-375 from provisions that already currently exist in legislation when it comes to exemptions or delegating impact assessment to a provincial government. We will study that in committee for further guidance. The Bloc Québécois would like to say that there are three reasons we are in support of the bill under study. First, we have been fighting so that all projects, including those under federal jurisdiction, follow Quebec's laws and bylaws of Quebec's municipalities. The second reason we support this is that in Quebec, our environmental impact assessments are in fact more thorough than the federal process, and ours are also better adapted to the expectations of our people than the federal version. So we feel that it would never be possible for a Quebec assessment to be less thorough than a federal assessment. So we need to best protect our environment and, as such, the needs and goals of Quebec and of its people. Thirdly, we need to avoid absurd situations. For instance, when projects are assessed under the federal legislation, when they've already been rejected by a Quebec ruling after a Quebec environmental assessment. A recent example of this is LNG, Liquefied Natural Gas Quebec. The federal government overruled the Quebec decision, the result of Quebec's impact assessment. So we will have to discuss this type of situation in committee. There's something very critical that warrants being repeated. That is jurisdiction and jurisdiction sharing in the context of environment. All governments must fulfill their responsibilities and their obligations. Protecting the environment is one such obligation. In that sense, the Bloc proposes that the Government of Canada do so by never acting against the environmental laws and policies of Quebec. Here's the problem, though. Ottawa grants itself the right to circumvent Quebec's laws for activities and operations and work that is under Quebec jurisdiction. Some operations and infrastructure are exempt from Quebec's laws because they're under federal jurisdiction. A few examples: wharves, ports, airports, telecoms infrastructure, federal property. That's harmful to Quebec. We call on the federal government to uphold Quebec's laws for all federal work and operations which take place in Quebec. Moreover, we defend the unanimous will of the National Assembly of Quebec. They called for Quebec's environmental sovereignty. Over 2 years ago, on April 13th, 2022, parliamentarians of all parties represented at the National Assembly unanimously adopted a motion confirming the primacy or priority of Quebec's jurisdiction when it comes to the environment, and expressing unanimous opposition to all federal action when it comes to the environment in Quebec. We refer to that as Quebec's environmental sovereignty. In 2018, I presented a bill to that effect in the House of Commons. The Conservatives and the Liberals voted against it. I hope that now, at least the official opposition will be in supporting our amendments. I'd like to talk to you about the Port of Quebec. The Port of Quebec causes dust in the Limoilou neighborhood. We used to call it red dust. It was all over the Limoilou neighborhood. You wouldn't have wanted to read that in, Mr. Speaker, and I wouldn't either. Quebec's environmental inspectors visited the port, and you know what they were told? Oh no, everything's fine here, and in fact you have no business here because this is federally regulated, this port. That's not the type of situation that we want to find ourselves in. Only the Bloc Québécois solution would ensure that our Environmental Protection Act and our land use planning legislation applies in Quebec. Now, the federal government loves to brag about its environmental action, but at the end of the day, it's important to acknowledge that regulation and legislation are the best tools to protect the environment, and those tools must be used and respected. But too often, Ottawa says one thing and does another. Would you like all the examples? Well, I won't have time to cite all the examples. We can't aim for perfection. That's unreasonable. But one thing is very undeniable. We're not going to take any lessons from Canada when it comes to environmental protection. Quebec's environmental protection legislation goes well beyond Canada's. It is much more thorough. Our Environment quality law has been in effect since March 2018, and it is our main legislation to protect the environment in Quebec. It enables us to move Quebec forward responsibly and in a way that benefits all by creating a modern environmental assessment and authorization system, which is clear, predictable, optimized, and up to the highest standards when it comes to environmental protection. We have some more specific legislation as well. And through our legislation, we forbid degrading the quality of the environment through emitting pollutants or contaminants. We also give, through our legislation, we give Quebecers recourse if they are affected by environmental quality, recourses for protection, and we safeguard living species as well. Our legislation also created a system for access to information, as well as governing any project or activity that can have an impact on wetlands or water areas. So land use planning, and protection of the environment are regulated by Quebec and its municipalities. And the same goes for other provinces in Canada. The Bloc Québécois does feel that this bill is quite narrow and that there are some missing provisions. That said, Mr. Speaker, we will support the bill through the process that it will follow, but because there is a lot of potential for this bill to help Ottawa respect Quebec and provinces and their provincial legislation. It would be so incredible if finally the state respected our jurisdiction, because Ottawa is constantly not following its own constitution and constantly seeking to meddle with provinces. Point of order. The Honourable Environment and Climate Change Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I feel that I wish to request that the next session adjourn at midnight.
Agreement could not be reached under the provision of Standing Order 78.1 or 78.2 with respect to the second reading stage of Bill C-64, an act respecting pharmacare. Under the provision of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that a Minister of the Crown will propose at the next sitting a motion to allow a specific number of days or hours for the consideration and disposal of proceedings at the said stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to order made on Wednesday, February 28, 2024, the Minister's request to extend the sitting is deemed adopted. Reprise du débat, l'honorable...
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise to speak to this bill. Environmental impact assessments are incredibly important because in Quebec, in Canada, and around the world, there is an ongoing environment crisis, biodiversity crisis, and climate change crisis. Now, I was rather surprised by the speech made by the member for Repentigny. I wish to remind my Bloc colleague that pollution and greenhouse gases do not recognize provincial borders. What's occurring in the prairies in the west or in northern Canada do impact the lives of Quebecers and other Canadians. I'd like to provide a bit of context. A very important report was published this week by the Department of Environment and Climate Change, saying that GHG emissions had increased by 10 megatons between 2021 and now. And the Environment Minister seems thrilled by this report. He seems very happy about these published results, which is shocking because he says, well, things are not as bad as 2019. Because, in fact, in 2020, something occurred which had an impact on our GHG emissions. The pandemic, that is. The minister's statistics are based on the pandemic. But without the pandemic, there wouldn't have been GHG reductions. Also, from 2005 to 2022, Canada's global emissions decreased by a measly 7%, and that was largely because of the pandemic, which shut down economic development, transportation, trade. So the economy was put on pause. That's what led to a significant reduction in GHG emissions. Currently, the goal that the Liberals have agreed to is a 45% decline in emissions by 2030. We have only accomplished 7% of that. We have 5.5 years to decrease our emissions by 38%, Mr. Speaker. We only accomplished 7% in decrease, and largely because of the pandemic, and the government expects us to believe that they can accomplish the rest of the goal by 2030. Or maybe we'll have another pandemic, and that will help. Who knows? The Liberals are hot and cold. They seem unable to seriously tackle big oil and heavy emitters, heavy polluters, who are largely responsible for most of our emissions through their major projects. For example, Trans Mountain. The government bought Trans Mountain with $34 billion of taxpayer money. The Globe and Mail revealed that the government wanted to tax record profits of big oil and gas, but at the very last minute, pressured by lobbyists, they backtracked, and they did not put it in the budget, but they were going to, according to the Globe and Mail and their journalists. This shows how powerful big oil lobbyists are when it comes to influencing the Liberals and the Conservatives. Now, I'd like to speak to this bill in particular. The sector that emits the most emissions is the oil and gas sector. They are responsible for over 30% of emissions. They are the ones who are increasing their environmental negative impact more. They pollute the most, and they're polluting increasingly more and more. And the best way to put an end to this folly is to cap oil and gas sector emissions. The Liberals and the Environment Minister, the member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie, keep promising us that it's just around the corner, but here we are still waiting. Today, during question period, I really liked this, we found out that the Liberals are committed to publishing a draft. Wonderful! A draft. A draft to describe potential, possible legislation that we might see one day. It's not serious, but this is urgent. We need to cap oil and gas emissions. The Environment Minister, though, thinks we can wait around a little longer. But we can't wait. A few weeks ago, the government of Alberta announced that forest fire season had already begun. It will be worse this summer than last summer. My NDP colleague, the member for Victoria, said she never thought that there'd be forest fires in British Columbia in winter time. But this is the new norm. For those who breathed in forest fire smoke last summer, well, they should get ready, because this summer it will be even worse. And last summer might even be one of the worst. People are dying from air pollution, from forest fires, and also from small particles in the air. Here's the truth. We need an Impact Assessment Act to assess major projects in order to ensure that we are following our Paris Agreement goals, to ensure that we are protecting biodiversity, to ensure that we're working towards reconciliation, and also to ensure that we are properly consulting local communities. Now, I understand the member for Louis Saint-Laurent who says that we need to avoid unnecessary duplication of processes. He says it's better to have one process than two. Well, I advise caution, because sometimes the federal government has specific responsibilities. For example, with regard to biodiversity or species at risk, I feel that it's important to have a process that will guarantee respect of our international treaties, especially the Paris Agreement. We also need to protect our commitments toward Indigenous peoples and toward species at risk. This disengagement will give some provinces the ability to be the only ones authorizing projects that might have huge impacts on all Canadians. We in the NDP are worried about rubber stamping. We're worried about fast tracking and green lighting all kinds of projects, always saying yes, and we're worried that that will increase negative consequences for our environment and for our ecosystems. We voted against C69 because we felt it wasn't strong enough. The minister was going to have too much discretionary power, and that worried us. Thanks to that bill, though, there's a mine in Alberta, the Vista mine. There were people fighting for it to be assessed, for there to be an environmental assessment. In the current situation, in the current climate and environmental crisis that we're experiencing, well, the NDP does not want to do away with a tool that can make a difference. That's why we feel it's not enough to say, oh, well, the province is taking care of it and that's fine. Moving on.
Accepter.
Sometimes these agreements will sometimes be approved, but if there's a Conservative government, they might greenlight projects that will have a huge negative impact and that will not go in the same sense as our international commitments. We need strong action and a strong commitment. The Liberal government needs to be present and vigilant. The Liberal government needs to do what it should, protect the environment, and go after heavy emitting sectors, that is, the oil and gas sector. We need to ensure the cleanness of our air, our water, and our environment so that all Canadians can live in healthy communities. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, GHG emissions and pollutions, no borders, not provincial borders, not national borders. We need to be responsible and we need to protect our future and the future of our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Portage Lisgar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to support my dear friend, the Conservative MP from Louis Saint Laurent. His private member's bill is timely and will inject some badly needed common sense into how we conduct environmental impact assessments in this country. The goal of this legislation is rather straightforward. It would allow for a single environmental impact assessment for each project to avoid unnecessary duplication. It would make the system more efficient, more cooperative, and more predictable. All things that no one in Canada could ever possibly say about the current environmental assessment process. The legislation proposes the creation of a mechanism of agreement between the federal and provincial governments to reduce duplication of federal and provincial environmental assessments. Now, it speaks volumes that a prairie boy from Manitoba and a distinguished parliamentarian from Quebec can see eye to eye on such an important issue facing our country. In our Conservative caucus, we work together on ways to bring our country together rather than tear us apart. We understand that a rising tide lifts all boats, and we don't go looking for fights with premiers or infringe on provincial jurisdiction. Now, under this Liberal government, of course, that has not always been the case. We have seen ministers, and even the Prime Minister, pit East versus West and rural versus urban. It shouldn't be this way. It's dangerous and it's short-sighted. No wonder why there is more division and anger than at any moment in my life in this country. Now, I view this legislation as a first step in rebuilding that trust and respect amongst our regions and our provinces. It will provide a pathway for all levels of government to sit down and work together to actually get projects off the ground. And as the member for Louis Saint Laurent so eloquently said during his speech, the bill, quote, strives for collaboration, not confrontation. The Ottawa knows best approach is what is dividing our country. We only have to look at the Supreme Court's decision on Bill C-69, which found certain elements to be unconstitutional. It was a naked federal power grab that infringed on provincial jurisdiction. And while it was unfortunate that it took the Supreme Court to determine that this once and for all, it provides all of us a reminder that even the federal government can be humbled. Even the most powerful and sanctimonious are not exempt from the Constitution. There was once a time in this country where we got things built. The railway that forged the nation together and connected East and West. the St. Lawrence Seaway that opened the country to the Atlantic Ocean, or the Trans-Canada Pipeline, where Western Energy fueled the major cities of Eastern Canada. These projects provided the foundation of our economy, and without them, we could not get our products to market. And I simply cannot imagine what our economy would look like today without them. And they are still contributing, Mr. Speaker. They are still contributing wealth and prosperity to our country, creates countless jobs, and contributes the taxes that pays for our schools, our health care, and our highways. This brings us to the bill we have in front of us today. Canada is now a place where undertaking a project has become so risky, companies would rather take their money elsewhere, anywhere for that matter. And the proof is in the pudding, Mr. Speaker. The number of natural resource projects completed between 2015 and 2024 has declined by 36.4%. And according to the government's own numbers, in its annual inventory, it shows a steep decline in major projects that are under construction or planned in the next 10 years. In 2015, the inventory held $711 billion in major projects, but by 2023, that had dropped to just $572 billion. The reality is that over the years, governments have made it so incredibly complicated, layered with various departments and agencies, that navigating the environmental assessment process is simply too daunting for people and companies to want to do. Now, I would be remiss to not point out that various politicians, such as the current Minister of Environment and Climate Change, they view this regulatory nightmare as a success because it stops certain projects from ever getting off the ground in our country. But don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker. In a previous lifetime, as an environmental activist with a bit of a penchant for getting arrested every now and then, our Minister of Environment was quite proud of his efforts to derail the Energy East pipeline. The reality is that activists will never agree to certain projects, regardless of the process or conditions or even their purpose. There's no lithium mine that could be used to build electric batteries in this country that would be good enough for these activists. They'll move on from one argument to the next until something sticks. They believe if they can bog down the entire process, inevitably it will scare off the proponent of that project. It is disingenuous, as almost all of these activist organizations, many of them, if not most of them, foreign funded, have no intention of trying to make sure certain projects are built in the most environmentally conscious way. They want them stopped, no matter what and at all costs. And now, unfortunately, the fox is in the henhouse, running the Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. No wonder why Canada can't get anything built anymore. The truth is that these activists will use every tool at their disposal, including hijacking the environmental assessment process to advance their own ideological goals. Now, that is their right. We do live in a democracy. People are entitled to their opinions, and they're entitled to speak out as they see fit. But what people aren't allowed to do, Mr. Speaker, is to violently attack pipeline workers, like what's happened in British Columbia. The fact that radicals armed with axes attacked their fellow citizens just because they were working on an approved pipeline speaks volumes to how radicalized some people have gotten in this country, and no thanks to the Prime Minister and to this current government. So how did we end up in a place where extremists threaten fellow Canadians, vandalize and destroy property, and defy court orders? How did we become a place where activists can just barge into a room and violently disrupt an energy board hearing? The reality is that even when governments think they are creating the conditions to get a social license, it will never appease these activists. They aren't interested in the facts. They don't care about the evidence. They just want to stop projects from being built in this country. I challenge any one of my fellow MPs to ponder this question. In the year 2024, could we have built the Canadian Pacific Railway through the Rocky Mountains? Really, think about it. Does anybody believe we could actually have built that railway in this current process? Could we have built the Trans-Canada Pipeline through the Canadian Shield if this project started in 2024? It's a frightening thought experiment, but it underscores how precarious our situation is currently. And whoever would have thought that the federal government would have spent billions of dollars to nationalize a pipeline just to get it built in this country? As we look to the future and to the incredible deposits and wealth of natural resources of critical minerals that our nation has been blessed with, will Canada seize the moment, or will it just be yet another wasted opportunity? Now, sadly, under this current Liberal government, they have not only failed to capitalize on that opportunity, but they have made it that much more difficult to get a mine up and running. In fact, under their watch, we have seen a decline of 36.4% of completed mines and a 55% drop in total value of proposed mining projects. At the time when these critical minerals are needed to build our electronics, our batteries, and our solar panels, do we have an impact assessment process that will get these mines operational? At a time that the Beijing regime has cornered the critical minerals market, which puts our manufacturers and our entire supply chains at risk, do we have an impact assessment process to free ourselves from the whims of a dictatorial country and become a reliable supplier to our allies in an increasingly volatile world? And at a time that our European allies are desperate to rid themselves of Russian energy, do we have an assessment process to build infrastructure to get our LNG to port? These are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves. Do we want to be a nation that upholds stringent environmental standards but also excels in actually getting things built? Or do we want to be a nation that stifles every opportunity at every turn while our adversaries and other nations around the world take advantage of their wealth of natural resources? I say, let's work with our provincial counterparts to make government efficiency the standard practice rather than the occasional experience. Let's respect the Constitution and provincial jurisdiction. Let's stop the adversarial legal and political battles preferred by the high-priced lobbyists and lawyers. And let's transform Canada into a place where the foremost talent in environmental sciences, engineering, biology, and scientific research actually work together rather than at odds. Let's get Canada working again, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat, continuing debate. Si je reconnais l'honorable député Louis Sarah, c'est pour.
I'd like to invite the honourable member for his right to reply. Right of reply. Go ahead. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues who participated in this debate. It's quite moving when you see that you're bringing forward a bill to improve things in the country and you see everyone working on it. I feel very honoured. Now, the Liberal Party is against this, and that's too bad. We need cooperation here, not confrontation. And having a double impact assessment process will just make things slower. But we need to move things forward in this area. Now, when this bill was drafted, we felt that since it's at the federal level, it includes First Nations, and we had heard that it hadn't included First Nations. And so since that's the case, I will say that we're very happy to make sure that First Nations are treated equitably. And so it was my understanding that they were included, and if that's not the case, we'll be happy to correct things. I'd also like to thank my Bloc Québécois colleagues for their support. I'd like to thank my colleague for Avignon-Matapédia for her speech a few weeks ago, my colleague for Repentigny for her speech just now. And earlier, I forgot to mention a colleague I greatly esteem, the member for Rivière-du-Nord and committee, that he said about Amendment G4 that he had the impression that it was the Bloc that had written it. And it just shows that in some cases, even our best MPs can make mistakes, and that leads to the effects we know of. Now, the Bloc Québécois had concerns about jurisdiction and who would make the ultimate decision. So, Mr. Speaker, let's recall that an environmental assessment is scientific. Science rests on data. It's not political, but jurisdiction does apply. We need to ensure that the environmental assessment is applied. Now, my friends from the Bloc Québécois are still mad at me again. But the most polluting project in the history of Quebec, the McInnes cement plant, was authorized under the current leader of the Bloc Québécois, and there was not even any environmental assessment done. He decided to bypass the Environmental Assessment Agency of Quebec. That's the facts. Additionally, I'd like to thank my colleague from Rosemont La Petite Patrie for his speech, but the NDP unfortunately politicized science. Again, environmental assessments need to be scientific. It's not political. And when he says, I'm concerned that a conservative government will trample all over this and rush it, well, we know that this is not political. Quebec scientists would be as good under the current premier as any other. Alberta scientists will be just as competent under Ms. Notley as under Ms. Smith. Same thing for federal scientists. They'll be just as good under our future government, I hope, as they are now. The government, however, does decide if we move forward with the assessment or not, but everything that's under federal jurisdiction will be analyzed with the process that we've currently laid out. And I would like to remind us all of that, as our leaders said last September in Quebec, we want to give the green light to green energy and face climate change. We need to give a green light to green energy. If we really want to do something about climate change,